I see a name up there that I know pretty well because I read everything he writes. I can't believe you got the rock star on our show, Angela. But
Yeah,
gee, I wonder who I'm talking about. Who could
yeah,
it?
we're talking about Gil Duran,
Ah!
um, the man in the hour. We've been waiting for you to arrive. No, I mean we've been at this since 7 o'clock in the morning our time. So we haven't been waiting like, oh, where is he? But just it's been a long day. Um, Let me formally introduce you. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gil Duran. He is an American journalist based in San Francisco. He has served as the California opinion editor for the Sacramento Bee and the editorial page editor for the San Francisco Examiner. He's previously worked as a press secretary for California Governor Jerry Brown, and from 2008 to 2010, Duran was the communication director for the U.S. Senator Dianne Feinstein. He was the press secretary for Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Verragoza. And he was the communications director for Kamala Harris during her tenure as California Attorney General. He writes about technology, and his pieces regularly appear in the New Republic, the San Francisco Chronicle. He also writes two newsletters on the Ghost platform, and the Nerd Reich focuses on tech authoritarian politics, and FrameLab is a partnership with cognitive scientist George Lakoff and focuses on political language and framing. Welcome, Gil. Thanks for
Thanks
joining
for
us.
inviting me.
Welcome.
Yeah. Yeah, we are definitely eager to hear what you have to say about Tech Fascism 101, because that's definitely been a recurring theme all day. Things have been coming up about these tech fascists. So,
Yeah, you've been saying the whole time, wait till Gil Duran comes on. He'll explain it to us. So
Okay.
yeah,
thank you.
you
I'll
have
do
the
the
floor.
best I'll do the best I can. Um, in the last 2 years in San Francisco, I started really focusing on how tech CEOs and venture capitalists had infiltrated San Francisco and California politics. Suddenly, after years of Silicon Valley being kind of in the shadows or in the background, they had become very, very aggressive in trying to take control of the political system in San Francisco and push for their own caucuses and their own legislation, and they're getting their own way in Sacramento as well. And in some ways, that's not too abnormal. That's what businesses do, that's what billionaires do. But I started to notice a very strange right wing strain of thought coming out of some of these people. And thanks to my work with Dr. George Lakoff for many years, I have a keen eye for ideology, for different moral modes. And I could tell that these people were preaching a very right wing politics while pretending to be so called moderates or Democrats. And I wrote a little bit about that at the paper, at the San Francisco Examiner. But after I left, and I should say that it really reached a peak when Elon Musk bought Twitter in 2022. I was among the journalists he banned from that platform in his first few weeks of having the platform. And so for me, it became very real. Here's a guy who's talking about free speech while spouting all these right wing disinformation platitudes. And the first thing he does is ban a bunch of journalists from the platform for not breaking any rules, just for saying things he doesn't like. So I took a few months and started reading books and listening to podcasts and tuning into all the stuff these guys had been saying for years. They like to go on very long podcasts and talk for 6 hours. They like to read really weird books and tell everyone else to read them. So I just kind of immersed myself in their world. And what I began to see very quickly was that Silicon Valley had begun to create this whole entire new ideology, which some call the network state. And that's what I'll call it sometimes here. But what the network state calls for is very simple. The network state believes that we are headed toward a massive decline in the future, and that nations like the United States and other traditional countries will cease to function and will fail. And this network state ideology proposes that tech CEOs and venture capitalists must prepare for that by seizing power and creating their own sovereign entities in many countries that will be able to withstand the coming supposed collapse of the social welfare state, as they like to say. And then they will be the leaders of the new world that rises after this. I know this is very scary, apocalyptic stuff, but I think that's maybe the most alarming thing about these guys. These are billionaires who have some very apocalyptic beliefs. This is sort of doomerism or prepperism on AI and steroids. I mean, they've gone really deep into this. We're talking about people like Peter Thiel, who is all enmeshed in our government, etc. And so I started writing about this for the New Republic after first being turned down, by the way, by a lot of major newspapers where I have connections. People didn't want to touch it. It sounded conspiratorial. It sounded too weird, or they wanted some very reduced, basic version that wouldn't have said any of the things I needed to say. Fortunately, I found an editor at the New Republic who got it right away. And I wrote a 5-part series last year that walked through a lot of the elements of the network state ideology, how it was emerging in our politics through this network of very interconnected billionaires, most of them tracing back to the so-called PayPal mafia, which, in case you don't know, there was a small group of men in the late 90s who formed a company called Confinity, which eventually merged with a company called X.com and became this sort of digital payment system that later rebranded as PayPal. And the main characters in that PayPal universe were Peter Thiel, David Sachs, and Elon Musk, who are now basically in control of the United States government. And so what I did was trace all of their lineage, of their thinking and their public statements, and write this series that showed that they were listening to people like a guy named Balaji Srinivasan, who wrote an entire book called The Network State, How to Start a New Country, which outlines everything I've been saying to you here. It is free to read online if you Google the Network State book. There's a 1-paragraph version. There's a 1-page version. There's all kinds of versions for you to be able to completely absorb this and understand that I'm not the only one. I'm not just some weird guy on the internet talking about this stuff. I'm telling you what they're talking about. And there's another guy whose name you might have heard recently named Curtis Yarvin. Curtis Yarvin is a writer, a software programmer, and in the early 2000s started writing these pieces about how we needed to replace democracy with dictatorship and needed to have corporate run cities and enclaves that were outside of the normal jurisdiction of American democracy. And Curtis Yarvin is very, very close with Peter Thiel, so much so that some call him Peter Thiel's house philosopher. And a few years ago, J.D. Vance, who is another creation of Peter Thiel, who has been backed by Peter Thiel at every step of his adult life and career, started quoting Yarvin's ideas for hollowing out the United States government with a purge of the federal bureaucracy, replacing existing civil servants with people loyal to a so-called, basically a corporate-style dictator, a CEO who would be put in charge of reforming and destroying the government. And so in my pieces, I outlined all of this stuff last year, and a few of them went pretty viral. But for the most part, this narrative was completely ignored by the mainstream press. I'm talking about the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC. And to be honest, it kind of felt a little bit like being a conspiracy theorist, even though I knew that everything I was saying was, I put a tremendous amount of links in my stories to show where I got that, where that interview was, where that was said. And unfortunately, when I first started covering this, I thought I was writing about how this effort to take over San Francisco previewed something that was coming eventually down the road. But I thought maybe 5 to 10 years, they're going to practice on San Francisco and California. Can you use tech money to take over politics and have a government that really answers to tech? What changed was J.D. Vance getting onto the Trump ticket, which was something that was brokered by Peter Thiel. And suddenly, everything kind of escalated and accelerated, a word they like to use a lot faster than I anticipated it would. So one thing I got really wrong was I thought I'd write a series of stories about California and San Francisco, and 5, 10 years down the road, people would look back and say, well, there was a warning in those stories that this was going to happen. What happened was this created an opportunity to maximize and join up with Trump and the MAGA movement and take over our government, which is what happened. And so now we have, the New York Times, a few days before the inauguration, did a profile of Curtis Yarvin, who I had profiled back in July. And we're starting to see the narrative finally bubble up a little bit in the mainstream media. There's a memo going around Washington right now that was written by some apparently bipartisan group of researchers that outlines how this network state group is infiltrating government and trying to do all of the things that they've been saying they were going to do for decades. A lot of that is based on my work, though I'm not mentioning it at all, which is fine. And I have no idea who put it together. All I understand is it's a bipartisan group of researchers. But so it's not that our leaders in Washington don't know what's happening. For some reason, there's still a bit of an allergy for the mainstream media and the Democratic establishment to talk about this openly and directly, right? They're more sort of chasing after the symptoms of the chaos that's being caused in Washington by Elon Musk's takeover, but they aren't saying, hey, these guys have been writing about this and talking about this for decades, and they seem to be doing that. And that's what I've tried to do both in my stories and in my newsletter, The Nerd Reich, where I talk on a weekly basis about how what's happening in Washington reflects long laid plans for exactly what seems to be happening. And we are breaking through a bit. Yesterday, Wired had a story that part of the network state idea is to create these little tech-controlled enclaves around the world, which they call network states. I mentioned this earlier, the idea of these sovereign territories run by tech corporations that would not function according to the rules of democracy and would be basically corporate dictatorships ruled by different tech companies. Yesterday, Wired had a big story that I encourage you to read it. We'll find a way to get you the link. But these folks are now lobbying Congress for legislation that would allow these new tech territories to be built. And so we see it unfolding. We see it happening. And I guess my main message to you, I know I packed a lot in there. I don't like to talk at length. I like to do Q&A a little better than give a speech. But the main thing I want you to take away is that this is not chaos. This is a strategy. These people have been talking about doing this for a very, very long time. And I think that our greatest weapon to defend our country from what's happening is for us to understand that and to demand that our leaders start talking about that, because we can't let this go on for too long that people think we're in some cloud of chaos or that there's no strategy here. There is a strategy here, and it dovetails in many ways with the long-running Republican strategy to collapse and shrink government and to empower corporations and billionaires to have more power than everyone else in society. And while there are differences between your traditional Republicans and these tech guys who have some pretty weird beliefs about things like religion and living forever and becoming part computer, transhumanism, all these things, they have some differences, but what they have in common is they very much want a society that is extremely hierarchical, with white, rich males at the top of it and everyone else below, essentially powerless and at the whims of these guys. And that's enough for them to move forward on what's happening. We also see a weird merging between these religious extremists and the tech people. The tech guys are starting to talk a lot more about in religious terms about this project. So there's something deeper going on here. It's organized, it's strategic, and you don't have to take it from me. You can go find the stuff these guys have been saying. What I've done is just organize and curate that conversation for others to see and understand what is happening. And I think that we have power to stop it. There's a lot more of us than there are of them. But if people don't realize what's happening, and if our leaders don't start speaking to it, that we have a small group of wealthy elites trying to destroy this country from the inside to create this science fiction dystopia that, by the way, is not going to work, I think we have the better chance of defeating it. Anyway, I know that was a lot to take in, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
A question right off the bat about the connection between Yarvin and this, what you're describing here, and Project 2025, which, by the way, everyone thought was a crazy conspiracy theory until they published it on the internet anyway. Are they connected? Are they friends? Are they working together? Are they working against each other, these two factions?
I think that they are not all friends, but I think there's a degree to which there was some kind of deal made at some point. I think that reflects the collaboration of a lot of different groups who came to some agreement on some major ideas and moved forward on them in a plan. Like you said, last year, the press treated Project 2025 mostly like it was a weird sideshow that some crazy activist thought was important. And the Trump people denied any connection and pretended they had nothing to do with it. And now they are very openly executing it, and even have Russell Vogt in there, the head of the project, as a main figure in government. So one of their main tactics is to do things in a very open, forthright way, and then just straight up lie about it. And unfortunately, we have a media establishment that believes in balancing lies with truth and presenting both sides, even though one side clearly has evidence and the other side is obviously lying. And so I think in Project 2025, and I wrote about this too last year, there was actually a conference in San Francisco in September And it was a conference between the Heritage Foundation, right, the group behind Project 2025, and the tech VCs. And the conference was called Reboot. And it was all about the coming massive transformation of our government in the next few years. And Reboot, by the way, is the name of a speech that Curtis Yarvin, the weird guru guy behind all these ideas, gave in 2012, where he talked about something he called RAGE, Retire All Government Employees, a plan to, once you take over the government, just gut the civil service, hollow it out, fire the bureaucrats, replace them with people loyal to a dictator, right? I'm sure it's all a coincidence that all these same people came together and called their conference Reboot and talked about all the things they're doing now. But this is the kind of thing that it got very little coverage in the media, right? None in the national press, which has mostly written glowingly about these tech bros and kind of cast them as moderates. So there's something going on there where I think there's a real ignorance in mainstream publications to how ideology works. And there's an allergy to talking about ideology and talking about how beliefs are structured. Instead, I think our political journalism establishment is more modeled along the metaphor of, I consider, is a dog chasing a ball. There's a ball, everybody chases the ball, everybody brings the ball back. That's the story of the day, that's the scoop. There's not a lot of investigation into what's actually happening in our politics and who's connected. At some point, I'm sure there will be that. And my dream is that maybe silently, someone like the New York Times has a whole team working on a big series that will outline all of these things and make it clear to the American people what's happening, because that's the kind of thing you really need to break it into the political class. In a way, the journalists wait for the politicians to say something because they're too afraid, and the politicians wait for the journalists to say something because they're too afraid. So part of my goal has been to just break through and push ahead with this narrative and try to force it into the public a little more quickly, because I think that's the key. So I'd say that there has been a very clear merging of these radical tech ideologists and the right wing. They see common ground. The tech guys bring billions and billions of dollars and massive technological advances to the fight. And the right wingers have the traditional hold on the Republican Party. Then you've got MAGA in there. Trump just wants, whoever can give him the most money, right? That's all started with a big crypto robbery where he got, millions and millions of dollars from a meme coin. Something that would have, can you imagine Kamala Harris becoming president and reaping a windfall of meme coin money? No, that would never be allowed to happen by the mainstream press, which would tear her down immediately and make it impossible for her to lead. Everyone just moved on from that like nothing. And believe me, that's just the tip of the iceberg compared to what's to come. I think the next few years are going to be nothing but a massive crypto scam, coupled with an effort to use that crypto money to undermine the power of the federal government and make sure that, we're left with something that is not the country we're used to having.
Yeah, I have a question. And it might be a little bit rambly, but so a few years ago, I read this sci-fi book series, and it was called Planetfall. It's by an author. Her name is Emma Newman, and it actually it talks about kind of some of the same things that are happening now, where the corporations take over the countries. There's no more countries left, and that the United States has turned into a theocracy, but it has still some technology. And let's just say it's not quite the end, but at the end of it, at the end of one of the books, the theology country, the US, I can't remember what they call themselves now. They take a rocket to a planet somewhere off. They got a message from some alien that said God was here. They get on a plane, a rocket, some kind of space thing, and then as they leave, they drop nuclear weapons to destroy the planet so that no one can ever come back. When I read that, I thought, the first thing I thought is, this is probably really realistic. And I'm a sci-fi fan, and I've probably read a lot of the same weird books that these guys have read. How much do you think that science fiction is like generating the ideas that they have and the things that they're doing?
Well, one thing we know about Silicon Valley is that they rarely come up with a new idea. They mostly reframe old ideas as a new innovation. And so I think all of these dystopias have already existed in sci-fi. I also hear a lot about Parable of the Sower. Snow Crash, Cryptonomicon. You can go all the way back to the 50s, and there were stories about, all of it's based on this idea that there's a small group of elites who are tyrannizing or oppressing, and the heroes are usually people trying to overcome that in some way, involving technology or whatnot, and trying to escape the tyranny. And where does science fiction come from? Well, a lot of the narratives in science fiction are also reflected in history. Feudalism, tyranny, all the old stories of how humanity and civilization emerged from these terrible patterns of human behavior where there's different orientations of society to arrive at what we have now, which is representative democracy. But yeah, you find all of these in science fiction, and I'm sure a lot of these guys read this stuff in science fiction. And I've often remarked this in interviews, and actually someone wrote an essay about this recently. But these guys seem to be sympathizing and identifying with the villains in science fiction. And what they seem to be trying to do now is to engineer an ideology and a system that leads to the creation of the dystopias we see in science fiction. And that's kind of, in a way, the clearest explanation I can come up with what's happening. Someone recently wrote an essay called, the tech bros learned all the wrong lessons from science fiction. And that's very much the case. Every time I write something, I've got a bunch of people telling me which book it resembles, or even games like BioShock, where there's something similar. You have to go into some corporate enclave and there's some adventure, and it's a world where corporations control these little cities. So this is not a new idea. This is just them trying to bring science fiction to life. And there's an idea that I think this dark enlightenment is a part of this movement. Some people call it the dark enlightenment. The network state comes out of the dark enlightenment, this idea that democracy was a mistake and we have to return to older forms of government that are fascist or authoritarian. There's a word they made up called hyperstition. And hyperstition is when you imagine something and then you make it happen. You bring it to life. So these guys are basically trying to hyperstition the network state and basically tech fascism, tech feudalism into reality. And yes, we've seen it before in science fiction.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, that's not comforting because that's exactly what I thought. I just wanted to verify it. We got a few questions in our Q&A box. We just saw a video, and it was when it was called "We Went to the Town Elon Musk Took Hostage," and that's Brownsville, Texas. And the question is Elon's hostage town a network state? It's where he launches his rockets.
Yeah, I would say that it's definitely fits the mold. I haven't seen Elon Musk use that particular word, probably because he doesn't want to give someone else credit for the idea. Elon Musk kind of jumps in the middle of this, but other people have done most of the thinking. But you'll find recurring the idea that the tech guys should get their own territories to rule over, and that should be the way things work. There was a piece, someone did yesterday, a whole thread on Twitter about we should give him all the land around his star base and allow him to do whatever he wants there. So you're going to continue to see this idea emerging that things will be better if we allow tech billionaires to have their own massive plots of land where they can create their own cities or countries. And that is exactly the network state. That's what that is. Even if they don't call it that, the underlying idea is very much the same, to exfiltrate their wealth from the country and to provide them with a territory, a sovereign territory that they can govern apart from democracy. There's a great book that inspired my own work called Crack Up Capitalism, Market Radicals and the Dream of a World Without Democracy by Quinn Slobodian, who's a historian at Boston University. And that book lays out the entire kind of history of this kind of thinking. Basically, it's not new that rich people trying to find a way to escape their money to other countries, create new territories and zones where the rules don't apply. This is just the sort of apex of the thinking so far, and happens to merge with the takeover of our government. One thing I didn't say earlier that probably be clarifying is in the network state ideology, there are two ways to create your own country. One is called exit. And that's when you leave and you get a new territory and you negotiate with a host government to allow you to be sovereign. And so you start a new country. They've got one like that called Prospera in Honduras. They're trying to start one in the Mediterranean called Praxis. There's one they're trying to do in Africa called Afropolitan. And again, this is Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, Sam Altman funding a company called Pronomos Capital to create these little tech enclaves, these little tyrant towns around the world. So that's the exit strategy. Then there's the voice strategy. The voice strategy is when you use your voice and you stay and you take over existing governments, which is what we see happening now in Washington, I would argue. So just to clarify, those are the two strategies. So when you see someone talking about, let's have a big plot of land and give it to Elon or some other tech billionaire, that is very much spelled out in the Network State book, which you can, again, access for free. I think the ideas are crazy, but I want people to understand it and not just feel like they're getting it from me.
Yeah. Are there any politicians who understand this?
I think there are politicians who understand this. My understanding from my connections is that people in the Democratic establishment think it's too esoteric to talk about. Like it's too weird to bring up the network state, or so they're kind of nibbling around the edges in this very safe way. Another thing I would be aware of is that, I worked for a long time, 17 years in politics as both a communicator in government and as a consultant. Here in California, a lot of the people that I know from that business who were once government staffers and became consultants are all tied up now with this tech and crypto money because they've become a huge force in politics and in lobbying and in campaigns. And so there's a great degree to which these guys have sort of bought up a lot of the big talent, and you're not going to get a lot of resistance out of some of the traditional people because I think a lot of people want that crypto money, right? We're being told that Alyssa Slotkin and Ruben Gallego are the future of the Democratic Party. And if you look at who's funding them, it's the same crypto guys who took out Sherrod Brown. So there's a move to co-opt members of the Democratic Party with large amounts of money. And at the same time, the same people are working to completely take over the Republican Party and control the government. So I think we've got to be aware of the degree to which this money is really infiltrating our politics and going to make it kind of complicated to have anybody stand up to it. Because, in politics, especially when you leave government and go into consulting, money talks. And I'm shocked by some of the people I know who are now basically on the payroll of people like Andreessen or Sam Altman or these other folks, and they're certainly not going to run any campaign or advise their bosses to speak up against it. So it's not clear to me why the Democratic establishment isn't talking about it. People like Chris Murphy are getting a little closer to it, but the only other person talking about it in the way that I have been is Steve Bannon, unfortunately. Bannon has this problem with Elon Musk. He thinks that the tech bros are weird, and he would prefer a different form of fascism that doesn't involve the billionaires. I think he also recognizes that they're going a little too far, a little too fast, and this is chaotic and has a chance to backfire when the economy goes bad, when there's a recession, when the stock market keeps going down, that you want to do this a little more calmly, right? You want to make people think good things are happening, not that bad things are happening. And so Bannon has been attacking Musk. And I've seen Chris Murphy quote Bannon attacking Musk, but they're not going to quote me on the network state. They're not going to quote Victoria Elliott and Carolyn Haskins, who are writing about it at Wired. In a weird way, the Democrats would rather quote Steve Bannon than quote any journalism that's been done explaining what's happening. So there's this real weird disconnect. And I think that's a role that Democratic activists can play, demand that these people talk about this stuff, because if they won't talk about it, no one's going to know what's happening. And everyone's going to be sort of swatting at the flies of chaos instead of realizing this is a small group of people trying to destroy this country from the inside for their own wealth and power, which is how I view it. So
I have a question related to that about the lack of clarity about which side are they on. I was also raised in Silicon Valley and lived in San Francisco, and I said I've been reading your writings for quite a while. And I grew up thinking of the tech bros, the tech entrepreneurs, as being heroes. They were the heroes of the Valley. And when I lived in San Francisco, it felt like they were the innovators and so powerful and in a good way and liberal. I never thought of the tech entrepreneurs as being certainly not conservative or Republican. But you mentioned that it seems to be above the political, the Democrats versus Republicans, and become something quite different. It reminds me of something that happened in San Francisco, or these outside of Sacramento, I think it was, where they were buying up large pieces of land. Was this one of your models that you of the, what did you call it?
The network state?
Network state. Is that what they were doing out there?
My
Billion.
first piece in the New Republic was about California Forever, and that effort to these tech billionaires bought 60,000 acres of land secretly over 5 years, and then came out of the shadows with plans to build this weird new tech city in the middle of rural Solano County, where there's not enough water, where traffic congestion is already a massive problem, and where the county specifically has rules in place to prevent this kind of massive growth. They basically were going to plop a 400,000 person city down in the middle of Solano County. And that was happening in the background, and I wasn't really paying attention. And it wasn't until I read Quinn Slobodian's book, Crack Up Capitalism, that it really started to gel for me that this is not just some random stuff happening, right? There's this idea that's spreading about creating these enclaves, these tyrannical tech towns. And so that was where my research actually started. That was the San Francisco political takeover. And at the same time, you've got this group of billionaires buying this land, trying to create a new city. And in a way, you have the perfect example of Voice in San Francisco trying to take over the government system, recall the school board and the DA, and all these tech guys with a Republican billionaire funding these recall campaigns, really polarizing Democrats against each other in a big fight. Modeling this new moderate politics that sounds like straight up right wing Republicanism. And then you have the exit plan, which is create a new city where there's no city now, where nobody wants it, but you've bought the land, so you're going to get it. So that was very much where my own investigation of this started. Before I'd heard of Curtis Yarvin or Balaji Srinivasan or any of this stuff, I kind of, my series in the New Republic is like a timeline of me discovering this stuff as I go. And it's very much how it happened. I didn't kind of have all this idea in my head. It was me learning it. And I'm actually right now in the process of outlining a book and maybe writing a book on this, which, believe me, last year nobody was interested in, and like shrugged it off or didn't respond. And now there's a tremendous amount of interest. So, I was kind of late to the game myself. There were activists online who were screaming about this stuff for years. But like a lot of people, I was like, well, that sounds weird. And I don't want, as a journalist, you're trained not to get into stuff like that. Random people on the internet telling you about some weird thing that sounds conspiratorial. Unfortunately, this was not, this was realer than I wanted it to be. And so, yeah, that's definitely a part of it. And I would say, lastly, that a lot of the people who those billionaires like Andreessen hired to try to push that California Forever new city project forward were all the people who work for Gavin Newsom. So there's an example of how it's easy to just pay a bunch of people $20,000 a month and they're working for your project. And, meanwhile, these same guys are going to take out Kamala Harris in the presidential race. So there's this sort of unholy thing going on where the people are getting wrapped up in the crypto and tech money. And I think that's a real strategic problem looking forward as a consultant, because it's going to conflict a lot of people out. 10 years ago, when I was still consulting, I worked on a bunch of progressive projects in California that had been put together by a very well-known consultant named Chris Lehane. Chris Lehane is now spearheading Crypto's PAC, which took out Sherrod Brown. So you can see the degree to which, when people are paying top dollar, people who were once working for progress and democracy will just kind of sell out to the highest bidder. And so, I'm still kind of early in excavating that particular thing. And again, some of these people are friends of mine. Some of these people are people I know. But when I see the Democratic Party and leaders who I know are aware of these things and have been reading my stuff, not saying one word about it, I have to wonder the degree to which people don't feel like they can, because everyone's kind of connected to this at some point. And
Yeah, that's Gavin Newsom just started a podcast with some right winger. Do you think this has Charlie Kirk? Yeah. Does this have something to do with the sort of blending of, right wing and Democrats?
I think that there are some consultants out there and pollsters pushing Democrats to adopt a more right wing position on everything, and who believe that that is the path forward. The lesson they seem to have learned wasn't that a bunch of Democrats stayed home because they felt like the party was not pushing for what they wanted to see, but that if we only become a lighter version of the Republican Party, that will be considered the middle or moderate. It's funny how the so-called middle, which doesn't actually exist in politics, is always further to the right. You never see anybody saying that the Republicans need to move further toward the Democratic side of things, right? It only goes far, far, far right. and everyone's mad at the progressives in the party, and they're the left caused all the problems. But the Republican Party is entirely controlled and run by the extreme right wing. So the lesson there isn't that you should be less extreme. The lesson there is that the extremists can win in the end and control the party. So there's a really, the Third Way put out a poll last week saying basically Democrats should abandon most of their moral values and issues and just basically be Republican light. I really don't think that's the path to go, but I think that there's a lot of money and a lot of futures tied up in presenting that as the path. And I think we have a real systemic problem in the Democratic Party. And I've come from mainstream Democratic politics. I've pissed off far leftists more than I've pissed off anybody else in my journalism career. I'm not somebody who's a radical. I worked for Senator Feinstein when she was the chair of the Intelligence Committee. I considered Senator Feinstein, although we know she was a Democrat, the most popular Republican in California because we often clashed on some of her very, very conservative views on things. But it's not clear to me why establishment Democrats won't touch this and won't talk about it and won't tell people what's happening, and why the prevailing idea is that somehow we have to move further to the right. People are saying, well, you got to get on stage, you got to do the podcast with these bros. Well, Charlie Kirk is well known as a white supremacist. He said MLK doesn't deserve his own holiday. He said that he's afraid when he sees a black pilot on a plane because he's not sure that that person is qualified. Well, I can tell you a very good reason why Kamala Harris couldn't sit down with Charlie Kirk, right? But apparently some people don't have a problem with doing that. And so I don't think the path here is to abandon the base and move toward the right. And I'd say there's a tremendous amount of money right now being spent to push Democrats along that path. And it's something I plan to write about in the near future. But this stuff has kind of, a few weeks ago, Heather Cox Richardson mentioned my work in her newsletter, and everything just kind of blew up. And to be honest, I was on the cusp of moving on and said, look, I tried to do it, told everybody what I could, but it wasn't really kind of blowing up. And so suddenly everything has changed, and I suddenly have a tremendous amount of work to do on this subject. So,
yes, you have to be our guide through this. You really do. There's a very good question in the chat box that relates to that. What strategy do you feel will solve this? And how do you think the situation with tech bros will influence France, influence us overseas? We're calling in from all around the world. How's it going to play out on the global stage? And what do we do?
Well, I think the first stage of the strategy is to be aware of it and to demand that your elected representatives talk about it and be aware of it. If people don't even know what the problem is, there's not going to be a solution to it, or the solution will come far too late. And that's what I've been trying to do through my work. People often ask me, what should we do? Well, I'm a writer, I'm a journalist. My job is to tell people what's happening. I am writing a piece actually at the Nerd Reich, which you can subscribe to for free, that will outline some strategies because there's been such a demand for it. Last week, a military analyst named John Robb, who's very well respected and been quoted all over the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, you name it, wrote a piece that basically said very frankly, this is a network state takeover of the government. Here's what the goals are. But he also outlined why he thinks it'll fail in this particular iteration. And he listed a bunch of reasons for that. Now, you have to keep in mind that John Robb is pro-network state. He thinks this is a good thing. He thinks this is a thing that needs to happen. And again, this is a military analyst who worked for the US government, who's advised the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who's very highly respected. So what I'm doing is I'm putting together for next week a piece that will outline a strategic communication strategy for trying to destroy the network state effort based on what John Robb identified as the vulnerabilities in it. So part of the reason I've been highlighting Robb's work is that I think that's the kind of person the New York Times and others might listen to. Like, it's not just me, it's this military analyst who you've quoted before, and he's just openly saying the thing. So I think that's the first part of it, is to understand it, and then to find ways to frame what is happening to the majority of the American people. I don't think anybody voted for this massive destruction of our government. We're already seeing Republicans showing up angry at town halls over the firings of veterans, over the discontinuation of their benefits, and that's going to increase. And the fact that we don't have an opposition party in this country that is exploiting that is engaging in full-on communications to highlight those things, instead we have Bernie going around giving speeches, which is important. No one is doing anything. The Democratic Party is failing in a massive way right now. And I think that we have to change that. The Democratic Party has to go into full-on war mode and start highlighting these things and getting to those swing voters and making sure that by the time 2026 comes, there's going to be a blue wave across the country to undo all of this, because they're going to do as much damage as they can as quickly as possible. So right now we're at phase one. I'm taking every speaking engagement I can get to talk about my work, to tell people what's going on, to push them toward other sources. But I will be laying out next week a document that's just here's if someone gave me $100 million to run a strategy on this, here's what I would do. Right now, will that happen? No. I will say I'm also in talks with some funders who have taken an interest and want to put together something, an org or a campaign to start highlighting some of this stuff. I'm not sure where that'll go. A lot of funders are really scared to take these guys on. Everybody just kind of wants to hide right now and not be in the middle of it. And I think that's the exact wrong response. You cannot freeze up in a crisis. You have to act rationally, calmly, and strategically. So how will this affect it internationally? Well, as we already see, they're trying to get involved in European politics. They want to push the whole world to the far right, right? It's not just here. They want a far right authoritarian wave across the world. Because again, you have to remember, go back to the book, The Sovereign Individual. The idea here is to collapse existing governments, to collapse the social welfare state, to sort the white people away from everybody else who can kind of go back to wherever they're from, and to have this new sort of tech apartheid situation in the world. That's kind of, if you read that book, The Sovereign Individual, this was sort of the vision that everything's about to change. And, you know, back in the 90s, you may remember that a lot of the right-wing conspiracy theorists were afraid of something called the New World Order that was going to happen. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the New World Order, and it's coming from their side, not from our side. Though I'm sure plenty of Democrats will go along with it if it seems to be what's going to win. So
That's so cynical, but it's true.
I'm not saying anything different. I mean, when I saw Gavin Newsom on stage with Charlie Kirk, not only that, but lavishing praise on him, right? Lavishing praise on a guy who's a known white supremacist. I've never had a very high opinion of Newsom because I've watched him for 20-something years, but this was even worse than anything I ever thought capable. This is a guy who had tears in his eyes talking about George Floyd a few years ago, right? So he's just going to go wherever it goes. So another thing I would say is never vote for Gavin Newsom for anything. So
Nope.
that's a point of personal privilege there. So.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I've always felt that, you know, his former girlfriend, who's now the girlfriend of Trump's son, like that
Don
was
Jr., I think
always.
he dumped her. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, oh, that's right. He sent her to Greece as the ambassador, as a farewell present. But I always thought that was a little bit weird that these two seemingly different men would like the same crazy chick. Like, I just thought that was like sketchy. And now that he's involved with Charlie Kirk, it's even more sketchy to me.
Well, Kimberly Guilfoyle, Newsom's ex-wife, former Fox host, former girlfriend of Donald Trump, is the one who introduced Newsom to Charlie Kirk, according to an interview that Charlie Kirk just gave. So
Great.
bringing it all full circle there.
Yeah, it's wonderful. We have another question. What is the connection with Putin? And is it the same wish?
Well, Anne Applebaum, who writes for The Atlantic, wrote an amazing book last year called, what is it called? Autocracy Incorporated, I believe it's called. And it's about how all over the world, there's this movement by super wealthy people and authoritarian governments to, Autocracy Inc. is what it's called, to use the same tools and same methods to create autocratic governments all over the world. And they've begun sharing technology and sharing tactics. And so while they might not be ideologically aligned in every way, they are aligned in terms of their desire to create a new world, a new post-democracy world is essentially what we're talking about here. And so I would really encourage you to read that, because in the book she talks about multipolarity, this idea that we should no longer have big countries like the United States and in the UK being the major superpowers in the world. We need a world where there's just a lot of different power centers and none are predominant over others. And that's what will allow for anti-democratic, non-democratic forms of governance to flourish. So I would say that, there are people who are more advanced on the Putin thing who, believe this is connected to something called Project Russia, who think Putin is pulling all the strings. I'm not someone who has gone too deeply into the Russia stuff, though, of course, following it, Trump's whole allegiance to Putin is pretty clear. We saw the Russian meddling in 2016. The Mueller report made it really clear that there'd been a tremendous amount of interference on behalf of Trump. So I tend to think, at the very least, what they have in common is a desire to undermine American power, because American power is the idea that democracy should be the system of government for the world. And other people, the tech bros, certain Republicans, others, they think that democracy is an outdated software system and it needs to be replaced by something else. You know, this guy Balaji Srinivasan, who wrote the Network State book back in 2013, described the United States as the Microsoft of nations, outdated and useless, and that you needed this new form of government to be born. The New York Times actually wrote a story about that speech in 2013, and they have not written about any of this since. So in a weird way, the New York Times is way ahead of this stuff back in the day, and at some point they just stopped writing about it, even though now all the stuff those same guys were talking about is now happening in Washington and on our screens every day. There's some allergy to, I think part of it, editors don't want it to be real. They think it's just weird. Again, I would encourage you to read that because this is definitely a global project. They're not going to stop with the United States. They want to go everywhere. As you saw Musk a few weeks ago meddling in Germany's affairs. It's definitely everywhere you go, you can replicate it. They also have this idea that if you do it once, you can scale it and do it elsewhere. Sort of like you do with a tech product or a technology, right? And so I would say you're not safe anywhere. I've had friends say, well, where should we move to be safe? Like, you're not going to be safe anywhere if these guys win. They're going to do it everywhere. And it's global in scope. You will not be safe far away. You have to fight it too.
So we will. So you began by saying that there was assumption on the part of these billionaires that the so-called social welfare state was going to collapse, right? So my question is, well, they're causing this collapse, and I want to know why. I mean, most people, for even if they're a James Bond villain, they think in their own head that they're improving society. They're going to do something good for society. Do they really think that this is going to help us make a better world? These little feudal states is going to improve life on Earth? Or is that not their motive at all?
It's going to improve life for them, they think. They're not concerned about the rest of us. That's pretty clear. You know, they don't view the average, the idea is that there's not going to, technology is going to replace most jobs. And what are you going to do with all the people who don't have work? You're going to give them all money? Well, there's a few handful of people trying to push that idea, right? But no, they don't want to give anybody any money. They think they earned all of their money and they don't want to share it. And so they want to escape into their little tax-free enclaves where they're fully in control and are not part of the social contract, right? And in the book, The Sovereign Individual, that so many of these tech bros find inspirational, it basically says that as the social welfare state and the nation state model collapses, there will be a tremendous amount of social turmoil and violence and a marked surge in crime. And that's just part of it. That's why you have to create these specialized enclaves with high security that are protected from the rest of civilization, right? It's the science fiction idea. Basically going back to the digital castle model, right? You have to keep everything outside of your gate. They had a network state conference, by the way, twice in the past 2 years. And one of the entire presentations was how to do security for your future network state enclave, surveillance, drones, hiring former special forces personnel to be your police department and guards. So they've done some advanced thinking on this. And one of the things I find interesting is that they foresaw this future of declining crime, but the United States has actually been at a very low, historically low period recently of crime. Can you guys see me still?
No, you blurred out.
Did you do that, or did the tech bros do it?
No, but we're back. Probably just a glitch in my Wi-Fi. So there's this idea that you have to have this securitized thing, but crime has been at historic lows recently. And one of the things I find interesting is all these tech bros in San Francisco have been screaming about crime. What they mean by that is homelessness, drug addiction, when violent crime is way low. You look at the 70s and the 80s, crime is up here. You look at now, crime is way down here. And yet they're screaming about crime in order to use it as a cudgel against the Democratic Party in San Francisco. And yet their own little prophetic text said there would be a hell of a lot more crime right now than there was. So the point there being that in this dark vision, the vast majority of people are left out in the cold. And I think that's why there's some political ferment there. People could understand that. Some MAGA person in Kentucky, where I spend a lot of time, is not going to benefit from this. They're coming for your Social Security check. They're coming for your Medicaid. They view that all as an expense and a tax on them. And they want to create a world where you're basically on your own. unless you can afford to belong to one of these corporate controlled societies they plan to build. So I think that if we can't find a way to frame that in a way that unites at least a majority of voters against these people, then, it's not clear what the whole point of everything was here. So
Wow.
since we are getting together here on International Women's Day, I'd like to know what kind of a role they have in mind for me and the other women of the world. We were talking about tech bros and all these guys. What do they want to do with the women in this world?
I think they see the woman's job is to breed and to be silent.
Wow.
I think
That's pretty repressive.
I think the Handmaid's Tale. I think the Handmaid's Tale kind of, Margaret Atwood, read Oryx and Crake and the Handmaid's Tale. She's kind of fleshed out the whole where theocracy and technology end up. So, it's all about this toxic masculine male culture, and Elon Musk just sort of wantonly impregnating he's got a new baby every other week being born. I don't think that, again, goes back to this hierarchical system where wealthy white men are at the top and everyone else is at the bottom.
Yeah, that's pretty scary. And, like I said, I've read a lot of sci-fi, and what they're waiting for is the event, something that happens that there's chaos in the world, and that, things go haywire. The government can't solve it, and the people are all like freaking out, committing crime, killing each other, whatever. And then the corporations have to come in and smooth things out for people. Yeah, it's a trope.
Yeah, and look, it's pretty open out there that Elon is installing his AI systems in our government and getting rid of people because he thinks the government can be run by AI. Well, who controls that system? Who keeps the keys to that system in the future? When Trump is maybe gone or whatever. If Trump is gone, that's another big emerging story, but that's a tale for another time. You got to keep an eye on how they plan to use AI to replace human government. And that, of course, gives them tremendous amount of power because it won't just be AI making rational decisions. There'll be an AI system designed specifically to further their own purposes. You can already see some of this out there in the news coverage, but as usual, the mainstream media is like, Elon Musk is using AI for, it's real clear, guys.
Yeah.
Like, do the reading, come back in a year, and then become a reporter for the New York Times. That's what I would kind of advise people at this point.
You mentioned again again, I've read so much of your work, the Nerd Reich, the
Nerd Reich. I have it. The Nerd Reich.
Okay.
The Nerd Reich, yeah.
Everybody who's on this call to grab anything you can that this man writes, because it's high quality, high level journalism, and it's frightening, but that's what it's about. So this event that Angela describes, could that be? Do they want to crash the economy? Is that why the up and down of the back and forth of tariffs and things? Is that the big event? What do you think is going to be the Reichstagsbrand, for example? Is going to be the event in your view?
That's, I don't want to make a concrete prediction, but one thing I noticed was at the end of the year last year, there was this whole drone scare suddenly, where all this panic about drones, and and Trump jumped on it right away, and the right wingers who were pushing the idea of alien invasion jumped on it right away. And so whatever the event might be, whatever crisis or emergency they try to invent to justify a further taking of power, it may not even have to be a real event. It can be something that people think happened, that people are told is happening, and it's not really happening. But as we've seen with the 2020 election and many other things, half of the people will believe something, and and most people won't. But it's real to the people who consider it real, and it's not real to the others. So we're living in a disinformation age. And one of the other things these guys are doing is they're going to use our government to manufacture disinformation narratives that are going to be hard even for rational, thoughtful people to ignore or disbelieve, because we're used to believing that our government is telling us important things when they happen, right? And so a big part of that will be the manufacturing of crises, that there doesn't have to be like a plane hitting the building like we saw in 2001 with 9/11. This can be the idea that something has happened and we have to respond to it. And there are plenty of people willing to go along with that. And so I think we have to become much better at critical thinking and be aware that our um, the key to these guys getting what they want is to be able to manipulate reality, and that's why I call it tech fascism. Is because one of the key elements of fascism is to create a complete unreality where people no longer know what to believe or who to believe. And then in steps the dictator force to provide reality for them. And so we have to keep a good grip on reality and stay connected to truth and facts as much as possible. So, and that's what I've been trying to do in my work. And but the good news is it was a lonely beat last year. It's becoming a lot less lonely. I think people are going to jump on this soon, and then maybe I can move on to other things. Because believe me, I don't want to be stuck in this world talking about this stuff all the time. Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah.
I have other things I want to do with my life, but
Yeah.
until people jump on it, I have to stay in the game. So,
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been very enlightening. And you have reinforced all my fears, but that's okay. It just gives me more power to fight.
yeah,
Um,
thank you, Gil. I hope that you can come back and give us an update at some point and give us some good news. We'll try.
well, the good news is there's more of us than there are of them
Right.
by a
yes,
large
We,
number, and we can win.
I don't know how much you know
yes,
about Democrats abroad, but we are a fighting force. We're a relatively small but mighty force in every country around the world, and we're looking for a good fight to fight. And this sounds like you identified something that we need to be
yeah,
alert to.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And yeah, if when you get your little consortium or whatever together to fight back, come back and see us and tell us what we can do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hopefully on the book tour, I'll be back. So
Yes.
anytime. Thank you.
That would be great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Take care.
Bye bye.
Um,
Okay.
so everybody, I have put together in the main document on what you can do to help stop the coup, but there's a section in there which I'm just going to separate out. That's where you can learn more about the people that were fighting. And I had a number of the things that he discussed already in there. And I'm going to go and put all the stuff as you can see, I've been collecting links from what he said. So I will add all those things to this document, but there's a lot of information in there about Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel and this whole weird idea that they have. Um, I would say we have definitely got to speak out and get people riled up about this. The one thing, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but the one thing that we have on our side is that we're a country where there's more guns than people. And I don't see how you're going to be able to pull that off. That you're going to be able to starve people and then make them be like, oh, we're so happy about that. I don't see that happening. But, I guess anything is possible in this age of disinformation.